Hi. So when I was told that I was going to give this presentation here, I was also asked to do the presentation as a TED Talk style presentation. Yeah. So I did my research. I went online. I looked, what's the characteristic of the best or the most popular TED Talks available. And there's two things I noticed. The first thing is, like in these most popular or best TED Talks, the speaker is given 20 minutes to talk rather than 12 minutes today. So maybe that's a good tip for the organizers for next year. The second common characteristic of the best TED Talks is that they seem to affect people emotionally. I mean, they seem to affect the audience emotionally. So in one case, that can be a very funny talk, and people have to laugh very hard. So those are good talks. But another style of talk is a talk that really moves people, and actually sometimes even makes them cry. Those are also among the best talks. And I think the very best talks are those where the presenter cries. Yeah. Now, I'm going to do my best not to cry during my talk. But it is my goal to try to make you cry towards the end of my talk. I'm going to attempt to make you cry for the position of less educated in our society. Before I do that, and to compensate, I'll start with a few jokes. So, who of you, you're good, you're good, doing good. Yeah. Who of you knows what chavs are? You heard of chavs? Not so many. So chavs is a term used in the UK, and it refers to people from lower social classes who are often a little bit violent or obnoxious in their behavior. It's similar to, for example, white trash in the US, or what we call in the Netherlands tokkies, for example. And, well, these are chavs. I know it's rather small, the screen, but so chavs, they run around in tracksuits and stuff like that. And, well, this is what you get when you Google chavs. When you Google chav jokes, you get these kind of jokes. I'm going to read them aloud. So what's wrong with putting 4 chavs in a minibus and pushing it over a cliff? Do you know the answer? The answer is you could have actually fitted 18 chavs in a bus. Oh, much better. So what do you call 20 chavs at the bottom of a river? No, it's a good start. And if you see a chav on a bike, this is a classic, why should you not try to hit him? Because, of course, it could be your bike. Now, if instead of Googling chav jokes, you Google racist jokes, you get this. So I'll just give you the first one. What's yellow and black and makes you laugh? I think you can all read it. And as you immediately notice, I see less smiles now than for the previous kind of jokes. And this is also what we find in research. So we've done a few studies where we have given the same joke, presented it to participants, and the joke was either about less educated people, or it was a racist joke about Turkish or Moroccan people in the Netherlands. And we do find that the jokes about less educated people are found much funnier and much less offensive than racist jokes. So why is that? Why is it that apparently it's completely appropriate to make fun of or express prejudice towards some low-status groups, but not towards other low-status groups? Why is it okay to express prejudice towards less educated people? And I hope I'll provide part of an answer towards the end of my talk. But first, I'm going to say a few general things about education. So education is a very important, or maybe the most important, social divide in our society, so in contemporary societies like ours. So education is linked, obviously, to economic outcomes such as employment, stable employment, income, but also to health, physical health, but also psychological health. So it's related, so higher educational attainment is related to fewer psychological disorders or lower rates of suicide. But also education is related to important societal outcomes. If you think of what's the most important political development of the last decades, it's probably the rise of right-wing populist parties. If we think in the Netherlands about politicians such as Wilders, or in the US, politicians like Donald Trump, right? And a lot of research shows that the fan base of those right-wing politicians consists to a large extent of less educated people. So education is a very strong predictor of support for these kinds of politicians. So, and that's the importance of education and the education divide. So now I want to highlight two particular aspects of education. The first one is that it is important, as I just said, but unfair. And with unfair, I refer to the wealth of evidence that exists that people's social background has a strong influence on their educational attainment. I mean, obviously, of course, intelligence and hard work, they do play a role. But decades of research have shown that people's the background of their parents has a very strong effect on their educational attainment. So that means that education and all these negative consequences it has is partly unfair. because it's attributed to something that's unfair, because the process, the system of how educational attainment works, benefits some over others. So, this kind of situation, if you're a normal human being, should lead you to feel empathy and compassion for the less educated, because they're in a poor position, and they've gotten there in a partly unfair way. The second point I want to highlight is that education is neglected. I think Das has already said that. So, at least, for example, in social psychology, we study, of course, all kinds of intergroup relations, gender relations based on ethnicity, or attitudes based on people's age. And there's a load of different kinds of groups that we study, but not education. It's not on the list. We don't study educational groups, even though it's one of the most important divides in our society. And I think also, as a society and as individuals, educational inequality is kind of invisible in society. At least some people in our society try to fight gender inequality or try to fight discrimination based on ethnicity. Nobody fights discrimination based on education. Nobody is trying very hard to improve the position of the less educated. Actually, the only thing we have to offer to less educated people as a sort of advice is get an education, change who you are. I see some people laughing, but it's a very serious matter. I'm trying to get to the crying here. Because I'm trying to say that the appropriate emotional response to this kind of neglect, I think, could be guilt and shame. And so I hope that, you please think about this, and I hope that the combination of empathy and guilt and shame, will bring some tears to your eyes towards the end of this talk. Tears for the situation of the less educated. And while you're preparing those tears, I'll talk a bit more about our research on education. So one of the things we've been interested in is education in-group bias. So it just means, the question we've tried to tackle here is whether people's educational level influences how we evaluate them. Yeah, so we've used different measures to assess that. One is a simple feeling thermometer, so we just ask how warm do you feel towards less educated people, or we ask how warm do you feel towards higher educated people. Different kinds of study, we use fictional individuals, so we use a short description of individuals. We tell them, this is a person who lives there, and he's this old, and this are their hobbies, and that. And so we compare two individuals, and crucially, we vary systematically their level of education. So one person does not have a degree, and the other person does have a degree. And so for both of these types of studies, we find consistently that higher educated people have much more positive attitudes towards higher educated others rather than towards less educated others. Yeah? And now, interestingly, among the less educated participants, this is not the case. And even to the contrary, in some cases, less educated people actually have a more negative attitudes towards their own group than towards the other group. Yeah? So less educated people are disliked, and they partly internalize this. They also see themselves as negative, very bad, very difficult situation to be in. So a second topic about education that we have been studying is the role of responsibility. This is because we were wondering what is the cause of this negative evaluation of the less educated. Why do we dislike less educated people? And we think it could be partly due to perceived responsibility. As you can see, this person is studying very hard, and we all know getting a PhD, it's hard work. We've all had to work hard, or we're still working hard, some of us. So we know that education always involves some hard work. And because it involves hard work, it makes it easy to think that only hard work is required to get an education, right? So the involvement of hard work makes us think that maybe education is completely due to hard work and is completely merited and deserved, and also all the positive or negative consequences of education are also deserved, right? We've actually investigated this, and we found that indeed, if you ask people about different low-status groups, so for example, less educated, and poor people, and ethnic minorities, and working-class people, and you ask them to what extent do you think this group is responsible and is to blame for their own low-status position, we find that less educated people are blamed much more than these other groups. Yeah? So even though these are all groups which have differences in outcomes, and some of these groups are different ways of conceptualizing difference in socioeconomic status, when the inequalities are explained in terms of education, suddenly we think people are to blame for their own bad situation. Yeah, and this, of course, ties into the ideology of meritocracy, the idea that everybody gets what they deserve or not deserve. Yeah? So this was the second point that I wanted to make about education. So to kind of sum up, going back to the title of my talk, which was the consequences of education. I think the consequences of education from the point of the higher educated is that they develop more negative views towards social inequality. Yeah, right. So when inequality is formulated in terms of education rather than, say, income, people have a more negative view of inequality in a sense that they blame the low status groups more. And so we find that higher educated people look down on rather than help less educated people. So, not very good. From the point of view of the less educated, so we've seen that they are disliked and blamed for their negative outcomes, and even sometimes dislike themselves. So a low level of education is a stigma. Yeah? It's a stigma rather than a positive source of identity. So it's something that people feel very bad about. And we have some preliminary research showing that this stigma of being less educated is related to things such as lower life satisfaction, worse self-reported health, but also problematic political attitudes and more racism. So it's a very important outcomes of this stigma, but we need to follow it up with more research. Okay, who of you has cried during my talk? There's no need to be ashamed. Who has cried? No one? Okay. So maybe 12 minutes wasn't enough for this talk. Maybe I should have had more time. Or maybe I'm not so good at this kind of talk, but I hope you do agree with me, or at least start wondering now. You do agree that education is something we rarely study, but we should study more. And that less educated people are in a particularly bad position in our society. And that we could do more as researchers and as society and individuals to help them. Thank you.